Hello, and welcome to Early and Often, the history of elections in America, Episode 18, New York, New York. Last time, we began the brief story of New Netherland, the thinly populated Dutch colony stuck between the English settlements in the Chesapeake and New England. New Netherland was founded by the Dutch West India Company in the 1620s as a fur trading outpost. There was no big push for colonization, and even several decades on, the population was only a few thousand. Most of the activity was centered in the town of New Amsterdam, on the island of Manhattan. There were no elections or representative legislatures, but there were small groups of citizens called up for consultation from time to time. The current director, or governor of the colony, was the one-legged Peter Stuyvesant. Today, we're going to wrap up the story of New Netherland and begin the story of New York, as the English would call it after they conquered it. You might think that the English and the Dutch would be natural allies. They were both maritime Protestant nations with a hatred of Spain, and for a while the English did indeed support the Dutch. But if anything, the two nations were too similar. Dutch mercantile prowess threatened to undermine English shipping. They were too much in competition to cooperate. At one point, the English even temporarily imprisoned the director of New Netherland while he was in Europe, as part of some greater geopolitical maneuvering. Thanks to this rivalry, and thanks to tensions caused by the English Civil War, the First Anglo-Dutch War broke out in 1652, during the Protectorate of Oliver Cromwell. The war didn't really reach North America. Connecticut and New Haven considered an invasion of New Netherland, but nothing came of it. The conflict lasted 2 years and ended with a minor English victory that did nothing to resolve the issues between the two powers. The next war would come within a decade. In the meantime, New Netherland continued to develop, or at least it became as developed as it was ever going to be. The biggest problems with the government had been resolved, as we heard about last time. Things wouldn't have been stable in the long run, but conditions were good enough to attract settlers. And in the 1650s, the West India Company finally started to do more to encourage immigration. Plus, economic conditions in the Dutch Republic worsened, which also encouraged more migration. But the numbers were still never that big. In 1655, there were only 2,000 residents in New Netherland. A decade later, there were 9,000. Of those 9,000, 2,500 were in New Amsterdam, and maybe 1,000 in the second largest town, Beverwyck, which is what the Dutch called Albany. Let's get into the demographics a bit more, to see what things were like when the English took over. In 1640, the West India Company had lost its monopoly on the fur trade. After that, the colony of New Netherland started to become more of a regular colony and less of a trading outpost. More merchants began to move in as more opportunities opened up, but growth remained modest. Tobacco didn't grow that well, and regular farming was slow to fully develop, but nevertheless the main exports were agricultural, if only because there wasn't much else going on. Such industry as there was, brick-making or whatever, was small and for local consumption, not for export. And many goods had to be imported from Europe. As in New England, immigrants came from the middle of society, craftsmen and the like, rather than the poor or the wealthy. There was an elite, but it was open to newcomers. Merchants weren't the sort of people to get too huffy about new money. Social mobility was higher than back home, especially in the first few decades. According to Jaap Jacobs, you could divide the colony into 4 rough classes. At the bottom, the poor, those who couldn't support themselves and needed aid. Above them, there were those who worked for others, farmhands and so on. Above them, the self-employed and farmers who owned their own land. These were the burghers, and they had some special economic and legal privileges. And at the top, you had the wealthiest merchants and the highest government officials. There was considerable overlap between the top merchants and the top officials. Over time, it was the merchants who became the wealthiest men in the colony, rather than planters or anything like that, and they also tended to serve in government posts. Of course, previous experience in government was an asset as well, plus you had to be a member of the Reformed Church. In fact, it was rather expected that the most financially successful merchants would also be the ones in charge of running things, whether or not they really wanted to. Refusals to serve were quite rare, even though holding office could be quite time-consuming. Religiously, New Netherland fell under the jurisdiction of the Dutch Reformed Church, which was the de facto state church of the Netherlands. It was the main church, the one that got government support, but as we've already seen, the Dutch Republic was quite tolerant and other denominations were allowed to exist. So although the Reformed Church was Calvinist, religion wasn't particularly intense in New Netherland. It was a very religious society, of course, but nothing like the Calvinism of the Puritans. Actually, the descriptions remind me of how religion has been treated in the United States throughout much of its history. It was universally expected that you would be religious, but religion wasn't expected to be the singular focus of your life. Rather, it was simply one pillar of proper living. However, New Netherland was less tolerant than its mother country. It wasn't that people in New Netherland were more pious than their brethren in Europe, it was that the leaders of the West India Company were concerned that too much religious diversity would weaken the colony while it was underdeveloped, by promoting strife and discord. The Dutch Republic was mature enough to be tolerant, but New Netherland was not. Or at least that was the fear. This was the exact opposite of how most of the English colonies outside of New England thought about it. Anyway, as a result, officials in the colony had to swear an oath, quote, that we shall help to maintain here the reformed religion according to God's word and the regulations of the Synod of Dordrecht, and not publicly tolerate any sect. In other words, the Dutch Reformed Church had official backing. Freedom of conscience was allowed, but not freedom of worship. You didn't have to belong to the Reformed Church, but you couldn't worship with anyone else. According to Jacobs, there was, quote, a fine of 100 Flemish pounds for preaching at such illegal religious gatherings, and a fine of 25 Flemish pounds for those attending. And Director Stuyvesant was a true religious believer, so he was happy to enforce these laws quite strictly. Of course, that didn't stop members of other denominations from coming. There were enough Lutherans in New Netherland by the 1650s for them to try to get a minister of their own, but their request to the company was denied, lest the colony should have to allow even more sects to have ministers of their own. Although after some more complaining, the Lutherans at least won the right to worship in private homes. When the Lutherans back in the Netherlands sent a preacher without formal permission, the preacher soon had to go into hiding to avoid being expelled from the colony, which he soon was anyway. It was only with the English takeover that Lutherans gained full freedom of worship. But while the Lutherans were respectable enough, Quakers were much more radical and threatening to public order. Quakers practiced an extremely stripped-down sort of Christianity that was thought by outsiders to be heretical, and in their early years Quakers often enjoyed flouting social norms. As a result, they were dealt with more harshly. You could still be a Quaker technically, but if you did anything at all Quakerish, you risked beatings, imprisonment, or even banishment. However, the authorities were hesitant to get too harsh in order to avoid a backlash, particularly among the English living in the colony. So while official freedom was limited, turning a blind eye was common by the end of Dutch rule. Jews, on the other hand, were less welcome than fellow Christians. When a group of Jewish refugees from a recently conquered Dutch colony in Brazil arrived in 1654, Director Stuyvesant tried to have them immediately expelled, to the general approval of the colony. It was only thanks to the intervention of Jews back in the Dutch Republic that they were allowed to stay. Even so, the government continued to pester the Jews when possible. Despite all this, New Netherland, and particularly New Amsterdam, became quite religiously diverse. There were Catholics, Lutherans, Anglicans, Puritans, Quakers, Jews, and even a Muslim farmer from Morocco. And the diversity went well beyond religion. There was great ethnic diversity as well. The Dutch didn't even make up a majority of the population. They didn't even make up a majority of the soldiers stationed there, 2/3 of whom were foreign. Many of the foreigners came from Germany or what is now Belgium, which weren't too culturally distinct from the Netherlands. France and Scandinavia were major contributors as well. But there were settlers from all over Europe, from Poland to Ireland. Numerous languages were spoken, of course, and marriage across ethnic lines was common. A full quarter of marriages in New Amsterdam were mixed. Although New Amsterdam was still quite small, it had become far more cosmopolitan than the English settlements in America were. Slavery was permitted in the colony, but it was too far north for large plantations to really work financially. As a result, the slave population remained small. By 1664, there were still only about 500 in all of New Netherland. Blacks, both free and enslaved, made up only 5 to 10% of the population. Like in the early decades of Virginia, slavery in New Netherland hadn't been totally worked out as an institution. Things were still in an early stage of development, and there just weren't that many slaves yet. It does seem that Dutch slavery was somewhat different from English slavery, though. Slaves were given relatively more independence. English slavery involved total control over the person of the slave, but slavery in New Netherland was more concerned with simply extracting free labor, with less interest in how the slaves themselves lived. Slaves could marry, own some property, even bring court cases against non-slaves. And like in the early Chesapeake, it was common enough for slaves to be freed, although some were only half freed, on the condition that they continued paying their masters for their freedom out of their earnings for the rest of their lives. Which is still a sort of slavery, really. And although free blacks were free, they had no hope of rising up in society to positions of any prominence. At most, they could own some land and maybe better themselves economically. According to Russell Shorto, quote, "There are even a few occasions when Europeans are recorded as working for freed Africans." Sex with slaves was prohibited, but apparently there were at least some marriages between whites and blacks. So, overall, slavery was present in New Netherland, but relatively unimportant. That would change, though, with the English takeover. According to Jacobs, quote, "A 1703 census indicates that slaves lived in 41% of the households in New York City. That was extremely high, especially for so far north. But we'll get to that later. So that's what things were like in New Netherland in the 1660s. It was a diverse trading center, rather like Amsterdam in spirit, but quite unlike the English colonies which it bordered. Now let's get on to the main event, the English conquest. King Charles II, you'll recall, was restored to the English throne in 1660, bringing with him a more aggressive policy towards the American colonies. Or at least his advisors pushed him towards greater aggression. The mercantile system was strengthened and the colony of Carolina was created. Plus, those tensions with the Dutch that had provoked the First Anglo-Dutch War were still there, and the English were keen to provoke another conflict. So the conquest of New Netherland was a natural next step. If the colony fell into English hands, then they'd control the whole east coast of North America from Canada down to Carolina. This was just one part of a bigger strategic puzzle which stretched from South America to Africa to Asia, but it was a good place to start. So in 1664, he gave his brother James, the Duke of York, aka the future King James II, aka the guy who will be overthrown in the Glorious Revolution 24 years later, a charter for the land roughly corresponding to New Netherland. They didn't control any of that land, of course. Well, not yet anyway. Then, moving quickly, the English sent a small fleet with just 300 soldiers to conquer New Netherland. This mission had a dual function. The fleet also went to Massachusetts to intimidate the Puritans into changing their voting procedures, which I talked about in episode 13. But after that, they arrived in New Amsterdam in August and ordered Director Stuyvesant to surrender. Stuyvesant at first refused. He even tore up the terms of surrender rather than risk the colonists losing the will to fight. But the colonists managed to get the terms of surrender from Stuyvesant, literally piecing the torn letter back together. And then, they did lose the will to fight. He delayed as much as possible, but ultimately there was no choice in the matter. New Amsterdam was totally unprepared to defend itself. The fort was too weak, there weren't enough supplies or munitions, and the Dutch had even fewer troops than the English. And there was no will among the citizens to fight a hopeless battle either. So, within a few days, Stuyvesant surrendered without firing a shot. And since New Amsterdam was the strategic linchpin of the whole colony, once it fell to the English, so too did the rest of New Netherland. Thus did New Netherland become New York, so named after the king's brother, the Duke of York. The terms of surrender were generous. Property rights were to be respected, the Dutch were allowed to maintain many of their legal customs, and most of the officials in the colony would be allowed to finish their terms. New Amsterdam was to be allowed to elect deputies to some sort of local assembly, details to be determined. However, these concessions were mostly pragmatic, a way to ease the colony into the absolute rule of James. New York was to be run as a proprietary province, just like Maryland, with the Duke of York having practically unchecked powers. And unlike Maryland, the Charter of New York didn't even oblige James to give the colony an assembly. His only limitations were the laws of England. In exchange for all this, James had to pay his brother the king 40 beaver pelts a year. Anyway, after the conquest of New Netherland, the Second Anglo-Dutch War broke out in full the next year. This time it went poorly for the English, although the fighting didn't reach New York. After a few years of warfare they lost, but the peace treaty they signed with the Dutch allowed both sides to keep the territories they had won in the war, which meant that the English kept control of New York, while the Dutch kept Suriname in South America. So less than 60 years after the founding of Jamestown, the English now had control over most of the North American coast, over 1,000 miles of unbroken territory. And the biggest chunk of that land was now in the hands of James, an exotic region full of foreign and diverse inhabitants. But although New Netherland had been a vast province, New York quickly became considerably smaller. The Dutch claims on Connecticut were given up, and James granted the southern section of his colony, the land between the Delaware and the Hudson, to two of his close friends and supporters. This land became the new colony of New Jersey, which I'll talk about next episode. The land southwest of New Jersey, what is now Delaware, was left in a state of legal confusion, but few people lived there anyway. So the province of New York itself was soon reduced to something quite similar to the modern state of New York. New Amsterdam, now New York City, was retained, as were Long Island and the towns further up the Hudson River like Albany. The part of upstate New York closer to Lake Ontario was still controlled by the Iroquois, of course. James took an active interest in the running of his new colony, but he mostly deferred to his advisors and he never actually visited New York. Local administration was in the hands of a series of governors. The governors each had advisory councils of 10 men or less, to be chosen by the governor from those men in the colony, quote, which have most reputation, both for their abilities and integrity, and for that reason most acceptable to the inhabitants. The governor was responsible for administration, and the governor and councilors together, along with a few other officials, made up the top level of the judiciary. There were two governors in that first decade of English rule, Richard Nicolls and Francis Lovelace. Apart from handling the takeover of the colony, they largely dealt with routine matters, managing border disputes, pushing back against Indian incursions, encouraging economic development, etc. The government of New York was run on a mix of English and Dutch principles. They didn't suddenly change everything, although obviously it became more English over time. The more centralized Dutch model was kept around for a while, as were other peculiar features like double nomination, where one group nominated candidates for an office and then another person or group picked a winner from among those candidates. On the other hand, English practices like trial by jury were introduced. As per the terms of surrender, the magistrates of New Amsterdam were allowed to appoint their successors, the magistrates of New York City, so the city government remained in the hands of men who were Dutch, although they now owed allegiance to England and they now had English titles, like mayor and alderman. Going forward, some officials were appointed by the governor, while others were chosen from candidates who were nominated by currently serving officials, as they had been under Dutch rule. So, still no real elections. Regardless, it didn't take long for most officials to become English. As I've mentioned, there was no legislature. However, in 1665, Governor Nicolls called a meeting of representatives elected by the towns on Long Island, most of which had been settled by Puritans, as I mentioned last time. 34 deputies from 17 towns went. This was an elected assembly, yes, but it was a one-off thing, meant to ensure that all the towns of New York were properly submissive to the governor's authority. At the assembly, the towns did indeed agree to submit themselves to James. The governor, for his part, promulgated a new law code, the Duke's Laws, which are somewhat based on the laws of Massachusetts, though with major revisions. These laws covered a wide array of subjects, but for our purposes here, the most important thing is that they set up how the town governments were going to be run, at least those towns from Long Island. Some of the towns further out either kept the old Dutch system in place for a while or were under the direct rule of the governor. But anyway, as far as these towns are concerned, although they were peopled by New Englanders and although the new laws were based on New England laws, the town governments that were set up were very different. Most importantly, there was no provision for town meetings or anything like that. Those were much too democratic for James. Instead, each town was required to elect a constable and 8 overseers. The overseers were basically the equivalent of the selectmen, while, according to Jacobs, quote, the task of the constable consisted of presiding over the local court and carrying out the orders of the governor. So instead of the town meeting being fundamental, with the option of electing officials if they felt like it, the towns only had the option of electing these overseers. And even these officials had limited independence. All of the decisions they made, all of the laws they passed, were ultimately subject to the approval of the governor. And part of their job was just to enforce the will of the provincial government, rather than the will of the people. Very, very different from New England. Another big change was who could vote. In New England, in order to vote you had to be a freeman, and to be a freeman you usually had to be a Puritan. Unsurprisingly, this wasn't going to work in New York. James, who had actually converted to Catholicism just a few years earlier, was hardly going to run his province on the basis of Puritan exclusivity after all. Religious toleration was the order of the day. So instead of religious restrictions on voting, there was a requirement that you own land. The exact amount of land was ambiguous, but you at least had to be a freeholder of some sort. The Puritan settlers were none too happy with this. Without a legislature to approve taxes and spending, they felt cut off from one of the most important aspects of government. They didn't even have local self-rule to placate them. As a result of this unhappiness, some towns began to refuse to elect officials, since those officials, after all, were largely there to enforce the will of the governor rather than of the people. Other towns went back to governing by town meeting, even though this was officially disallowed. Discontent was slowly building. On the other hand, the system of government was a much better fit in the rest of the colony, which after all was populated by people who mostly weren't used to self-government anyway. But unfortunately for the Puritans, the borders of New York didn't match the cultural borders that were already there, and they were stuck on the wrong side. Mismatched political borders and cultural borders will be a recurring theme of American history. However, before any of these trends went anywhere, things were interrupted by yet another war with the Dutch. The Third Anglo-Dutch War broke out in 1672, so not quite a decade after the last one. I won't trouble you with all the details, but basically, England was drawn into this war thanks to a secret treaty with the French to assist them in an invasion of the Netherlands. Well, the invasion happened and England was drawn in. Most of the fighting happened in Europe, but the Dutch actually managed to retake New York, in a near-identical replay of the English invasion 9 years prior. A small Dutch fleet showed up at Manhattan and threatened to fire upon the city should they not surrender. A few shots were fired this time, but the city nevertheless surrendered within days. The reborn province of New Netherland was thus put under Dutch control again, but this time under the direct rule of the government rather than the West India Company. The new officials began to take the colony back to a more Dutch form of rule, but it didn't matter. The Dutch won the war, but in the final peace treaty, New Netherland was returned to England, after barely a year back under Dutch rule. And so New York became New York again, permanently this time. It would be an English province until the American Revolution 100 years later. With the change back to English rule, a new governor was sent to the colony, Edmund Andros. Now, Andros is going to be an important figure for the next 2 decades of American history. He'll later serve as governor of Virginia, Maryland, and the Dominion of New England, so now's a good time to introduce him. Andros was born in 1637, a few years before the English Civil War began. He came from a moderately prominent family which remained loyal to the monarchy. As a reward, when Charles was restored to the throne, Andros was placed in the service of the king's sister and he served in various military posts. This service apparently won him enough notice to be named as governor of New York, his first major posting. He was an effective enough administrator in many ways, but he was high-handed and he tended to make serious enemies, a fact which would come to haunt him later on, as we'll see. Basically, the colonists tended to hate him, while his superiors back in England liked him, because he followed their instructions unbendingly. Anyway, James didn't make any big policy changes in New York now that he was back in power. There was still no assembly or anything like that. The New Yorkers petitioned for a legislature and Andros passed the request on to James, but James remained resolute. In his words, quote, "I cannot but suspect that they would be of dangerous consequence, nothing being more known than the aptness of such bodies to assume to themselves many privileges, which prove destructive to, or very oft disturb, the peace of the government wherein they are allowed. Neither do I see any use of them which is not as well provided for, whilst you and your council govern according to the laws established." End quote. However, in the early 1680s, James began to change his mind. The colony wasn't making him any money, and he was very keen to change that fact. All the other American colonies had assemblies, and if giving New York an assembly was what it took to get people to move there, then so be it. He decided to, in exchange for the payment of some additional taxes, quote, "establish such a form of government at New York as shall have all the advantages and privileges to the inhabitants and traders there, which His Majesty's other plantations in America do enjoy, particularly in the choosing of an assembly." So, in 1683, when James sent a new governor to replace Andros, he gave him instructions to begin calling a General Assembly, to be elected by the freeholders of the province, those who owned land. It was a pretty standard unicameral assembly. It could raise taxes and customs revenue, it could pass laws pending approval by the governor and by James, nothing too unusual compared to the other colonial assemblies. So, on October 17th, 1683, the governor, 5 councilors, and 17 delegates met as a body in New York City for the first time. Apparently, most of the delegates were Dutch in origin. They sat for 3 weeks. By far the most important thing they passed was the Charter of Liberties and Privileges, which was more or less a simple constitution for New York. The charter laid down a standard form of government. Towns were given representation in rough proportion to their population, basic rights such as due process and trial by jury were guaranteed, and religious freedom was guaranteed to all Christians. All quite normal stuff by the standards of the day. The charter was approved by the governor and sent back to England for approval by James, and while James did technically approve it, his approval was never sent back to New York. You see, in 1685, only a few months after James approved the charter, Charles II died suddenly. The death of Charles, who had no legitimate children, meant that the throne passed to his brother James, now James II. This meant that New York, which had been a proprietary province ruled by James, now became a royal province, just like Virginia was. No, that didn't necessarily mean big changes. James could have just kept things going as they were. But, in fact, big changes were afoot. James had in mind a reorganization of the colonies, which would soon encompass New York and New Jersey as well as New England. All of those colonies were to be merged into one greater unit, the Dominion of New England, washing away all pre-existing governments. So the charter drafted by New York was now outdated, and James's approval was rescinded. Not only that, but the brand new assembly would soon be shut down. New York's brief first experiment in representation was already at an end. It was time for a new experiment, one that would end in total failure and major rebellion. The creation and dissolution of the Dominion of New England will dominate our story through the end of the 1680s, but we won't be getting to it for a few episodes yet. So that was where things stood 2 decades after the annexation of New York. The English had totally taken over the Dutch position. But let's step back for a moment. What was the legacy of the Dutch in New Netherland? Or, I should say, what was the legacy of the Dutch in New York? How much of their culture or their politics survived the transition to English rule? Well, after the conquest, because of the Navigation Acts, trade with the Dutch Republic was mostly cut off within a few years. Immigration from the Netherlands mostly stopped as well. As a result, the Dutch became a smaller and smaller percentage of the population. They slowly lost their identity as they assimilated to English culture. A mere century after the conquest, the Dutch language was already declining in importance. And of course, the Dutch Reformed Church lost its position as the state religion, although there are still a few 100,000 adherents in America even today. Some elements of Dutch culture remain here and there, but nothing too substantial. For instance, words such as boss and cookie entered into the English language from the Dutch in New Netherland. And much of the American idea of Santa Claus came from the Dutch figure Sinterklaas. But ultimately, New York became an English colony and not a Dutch one. It was English culture that would predominate. If the Dutch left a real legacy to the United States, it was New Amsterdam and not Dutch culture itself. New York City was unlike the other settlements in British America, as distinct from New England and the Chesapeake as they were from each other. It was commercial and multicultural, a hub for all sorts of activity. New York has grown and changed unimaginably since then, but it still retains those essential characteristics, a legacy of the Dutch in New Amsterdam. It would be going too far to say that New Amsterdam contained New York City as we know it in miniature, but the parallels are more than obvious. Politically, one legacy of the Dutch was the practice of double nomination. Double nomination would be kept around for a while during the colonial era, in provinces like New York and Pennsylvania which had been under Dutch rule. In some cases, the practice would last until as late as the early 1800s. And let's not forget that several presidents came from these Dutch settlers. Martin van Buren, the 8th president, was entirely of Dutch descent. The town he was from, near Albany, was still mostly Dutch, and he actually grew up speaking Dutch as his first language, rather than English. The Roosevelt family, too, was of at least partly Dutch descent, originating with a colonist who had come over around the 1640s. In fact, according to Jacobs, during his inauguration as president, Franklin Roosevelt swore his oath of office on a centuries-old Dutch-language family Bible. So although they only controlled New Netherland for some 40 years, and although they never sent many colonists, the Dutch influence on the United States was greater than you might think. It didn't predominate, even in New York, but it was there. The Dutch Republic itself, by the way, would last until 1795, when it was overthrown during the French Revolutionary Wars. Next episode, we'll move down the coast to begin the story of New Jersey, and finally give the Quakers, our next big group of colonists, their proper introduction. So join me next time on Early and Often, the history of elections in America. If you like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. You can also keep track of Early and Often on Twitter, at EarlyOftenPod, or read transcripts of every episode of the blog at earlyandoftenpodcast.wordpress.com. Thanks for listening.